Hello and welcome to Talking Tudors, a fortnightly podcast about the ever-fascinating Tudor dynasty. My name is Natalie Grueninger and I'll be your host and guide on this journey through 16th century England. Are you ready to step through the veil of time into the dazzling and dangerous world of the Tudor court? Without further ado, it's time to talk Tudors. Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Talking Tudors. I'm your host, Natalie Grueninger. Thank you so much for joining me today. As always, I'd like to begin by acknowledging and thanking the generous listeners who continue to support Talking Tudors on Patreon, and extend a heartfelt thank you to everyone who's taken the time to rate and review the show. As an independent podcaster, this means a lot to me. If you love the podcast and you never miss an episode, please consider joining the Talking Tudors Patreon community. Visit patreon.com/talkingtudors for more information. Once you register, you'll have access to exclusive posts, additional monthly live talks, a member-only book club, patron-only monthly giveaways, to name just a few of the rewards. You can also support the podcast and share your love of Tudor history with the world by buying Talking Tudors merchandise. Check out all the products at talkingtudors.threadless.com. Now, on to today's episode. I'm thrilled to welcome Charlotte McCrory back to the show to talk about the final resting place of Katherine Parr. Charlotte is currently undertaking a PhD, investigating the tombs of royal women, 1437 to 1557, and how to project a dynastic and personal memory. She completed an undergraduate degree in history at the University of Kent, as well as doing an MA in museum studies at the University of Leicester. Charlotte has been fascinated with history since she was 3 years old, and the Tudors have always remained her passion. Outside of history, she currently works as a school librarian, bakes a lot, and is a proud Studio Players member, an amateur dramatic musical theatre group in Ilkeston. Let's dive straight into our conversation. Welcome back to Talking Tudors, Charlotte. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Natalie. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. Looking forward to our conversation. So let's begin with you just introducing yourself to our listeners and just telling us a little bit about you and your background.
Yep, so my name is Charlotte McCrory and I am currently a PhD student with the University of Winchester. And my PhD thesis is looking at the tombscapes of royal women from 1437 to 1557. So I cover all of the Yorkists, the Lancastrian and the Tudor Queen consorts, and I had to add in Cecily Neville and Margaret Beaufort in there too as well, because they're queens without a name. Yeah, so I currently work in a school library, but I do my PhD part-time, and yeah, having an absolute ball doing it. I'm really enjoying it.
And what a fascinating subject you're looking at as well. And I should just let our listeners know that we also recorded an episode on Catherine of Aragon's final resting place, her tomb at Peterborough Cathedral. So people can, of course, listen to that as well. But today we're going to actually focus on the tomb of Katherine Parr that has a really interesting backstory. So what were the key events leading to Catherine's death?
Yes, so Henry VIII dies in January 1547. And what takes over is not only Edward VI, but a regency council. Catherine kind of expected that she may be on said regency council. She had been left as a regent of England when Henry had gone over to France earlier in his reign, but this didn't happen. After Henry died, Catherine brought back, or shall I say, resumed a kind of relationship that she'd previously had with Thomas Seymour. Thomas Seymour is the uncle of Edward VI, and his brother was the Lord Protector. So he was in charge of the Regency Council. Now, Catherine and Thomas kind of scandalously got married a little bit too quickly. So they got married in the May. So you've got about 5-6 months, which wasn't very long in terms of like kind of court mourning or anything. And many people at the time felt that it was quite rushed. So Katherine does marry Thomas, and they both move out to Sudley. So Thomas becomes the Baron of Sudley. And Katherine soon falls pregnant, and she's a ward. She cares for Princess Elizabeth as well briefly during that time. But due to issues and some difficulties in the relationship between Thomas Seymour and Princess Elizabeth, she then ends up leaving. But Katherine gives birth to a child on the 5th of September, 1548, a little daughter. But unfortunately, during childbirth, as like so many women at that time, she passed away. She died from infection. And yeah, that's really the events really leading up to her death. It's shocking to think how much happened to her in the space of about a year and a half.
Yeah, absolutely. It's such a tragic end, isn't it, to Catherine's story, because she has, of course, been married several times, no children that we know of. So it's quite heartbreaking. Let's talk a little bit more about Catherine's final days and her death. So you've told us she's at the magnificent Sudeley Castle, which I highly recommend anyone visit if they get a chance. It's absolutely stunning. What do we know about those kind of last days of Catherine's life?
We know, unfortunately, not a lot. So we know that she would have probably gone into a confinement like most noble ladies at the time. We know that she did unfortunately die on the 5th of September. And then from there, events moved pretty swiftly. So she was actually buried some reports say the same day, some reports say 1 or 2 days later. It's very difficult to kind of ascertain, but it definitely was extremely quickly after she died that she was buried. Now, like her funeral service, you can tell that some of it was a little bit rushed, like the gentlemen and lady mourners that were there mainly consisted of people that had already been at Sudley. So, for example, one person that your listeners might know, Lady Jane Grey, who had been in Catherine's entourage, she was actually the chief mourner for Katherine Parr. But apart from that, we don't really know very much about her actual death. We know slightly more about the funeral that comes after. And this is because there's a brilliant document that survives in the College of Arms, which gives detail of the funeral service. So we know that they decorated the chapel by hanging it with black cloth and different coats of arms. We know that her funeral was conducted in English. So she had an English sermon. And she had English hymns. And this is the first time that we see this in a noble woman, because after events of the Reformation, basically, not really very much had changed. Henry VIII still remained fairly Catholic in his practices, whereas Katherine Parr during her life, she was very devoted to a reformist faith and a reformist way of thinking. So I like to think that she had some kind of say and some kind of desire to have this English liturgy in her funeral in order to kind of show everybody her faith. The person who gave her funeral service was actually a prominent reformer and her personal almoner, Dr. Coverdale. And there's lots of, well, not lots, but there's a few, I don't want to call them ballads, but there's a few writings from the time which describe her as a most learned queen, a guide. I'd never heard of this word before I read it, but a coadjutrix, which is kind of like
a new one.
I know. I quite like that one. I had to go and kind of Google it, but it's like a supporter, a co-helper for Henry. So it's clear that she was held by some people in very, very high regard when she was laid to rest. It was just she was laid to rest really quickly.
Fascinating. And so was Thomas Seymour there for the funeral service? Do we know?
No, Thomas Seymour, we think he goes to London, but we're not quite sure. I haven't found any evidence to say that he was actually with Katherine while she was giving birth or at Sudley. So it's difficult to pin him down, which is quite frustrating. I don't know. You would have liked to have thought he would have been there, but the evidence suggests that he'd ridden to London and there was probably some political matter that he thought was more pressing. Not sure.
Yeah. Perhaps he panicked, thinking, what do I do now after this? So that's really interesting about Catherine's funeral service being, as we've said, the service given in English. Really interesting. So we've talked about the fact that Katherine is at Sudeley Castle, that tragically she dies after childbirth or during childbirth. So where exactly is she buried at the castle?
Yes, so she's buried in the castle's chapel, which is St Mary's Church, and it's in the grounds of the chapel. And again, really highly recommend you go. It's stunning. The chapel was built in the 1460s by the Bottler family, and it's not very clear how accessible this chapel was to the local parish at the time of Parr's death. So we don't know whether it was just exclusively for people that lived and worked in the castle or for people in the local parish. But the chapel had actually seen many previous owners. For example, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, later Richard III, had actually owned Sudeley Castle, and so probably would have known that chapel quite well, one would imagine. When Catherine was buried at Sudeley Chapel, she was the only one with a royal status. But there's such a lack of comment in the sources over either why she was buried at Sudley and why she chose a specific place in that chapel. There's nothing in the sources to indicate this. She did write a will, but again, there's no mention to say, I would like to be buried in this particular place. So we can kind of delving a bit deeper into it. You can kind of explain the choice of Sudeley Chapel as the final resting place for Katherine Parr in several ways. The first is convenience. It's on site. It's really quickly. If it was her request to be buried quickly, or if it was somebody else's request that she was buried quickly, that makes the most likely candidate and quite a strong reasoning to choose Sudley to be buried there. There's another reason, which is dynastic. So Sudeley Castle was owned by Thomas Seymour. He was the Baron of Sudley, but we have the glorious knowledge of hindsight. So we know that a year later, in 1549, Thomas would be executed for treason and attainder would be put on him and Sudley would be removed from him. But in 1548, the castle looked to remain in Thomas's hands for the foreseeable future. Catherine's child did survive childbirth. So there's every possibility that they thought, well, we could bury Catherine in Sudeley Chapel, and then this could be the start of a dynastic family crypt or tomb. So there could be that sense in there, but that's less sure because we don't really know the thoughts and feelings of Thomas Seymour. You've also got status. Parr's, out of all the women that I look at, Katherine Parr is quite unique because not only was she English, she was not born into royalty and she had no living royal descendant. You can compare her on some level to Catherine of Valois, slightly before the Tudor period, but Catherine of Valois was buried in Westminster Abbey, but she remarried, just like Katherine Parr remarried somebody that was deemed to be lower than their status. But the difference being is Catherine of Valois had a royal son, Henry VI. Catherine Parr didn't. And Catherine Parr didn't really have a foreign royal family and dynastic connections to kind of say, hang on a minute, why are you burying our relative in quite a secluded spot without the majesty of queenship? So there could be something like that at play. The last factor, which is really, really speculative, comes from an article that Susan James wrote looking at the relationship between Catherine Parr and Elizabeth Stanhope, Edward Seymour, the Duke of Somerset, his wife, and how there was a tension between the two as to who was the first lady of court. Just going to say this now, I would absolutely love for there to be a series or some kind of book on this. It sounds absolutely fascinating. But it could be that she was in a bit of raw disgrace. So there was obviously a friction there with Anne. There was disagreement and there was displeasure at her very quick marriage to Thomas Seymour. And it could be that they decided that we don't really want her near the court. It could be that they saw her as in a bit of disgrace, and therefore they deemed Sudley to be a suitable location. One, because it was away from court, but because it was connected to then status, which was as the mistress of Sudeley Castle.
Yeah, interesting parallels, obviously, with what we were discussing about Catherine of Aragon, how there was this kind of, what do we do with her now? She's no longer queen, but obviously still from a prestigious royal family. So it's interesting how these questions obviously come up. I wanted to talk a little bit more about the original tomb, and if we know anything about what the tomb or the monument looked like, who may have been responsible for designing that.
Again, like most of my PhD, there's little evidence, but I think that we can say there was a monument. So one historian, Retha Warnick, did argue that Parr was buried without a monument or stone, but I argue against this. I think that we can say that there was something there. So multiple sources, like the one that we get at the College of Arms, record her funeral, but record that there was some kind of tomb, or there was a plan to be a tomb. So the precise quote is, "Pale for the corpse of black velvet and white cross, and it to remain upon the corpse until such time as the tomb be made." So that suggests to me that there was a plan of some sort. Now, when Parr's body was rediscovered, spoilers, we'll get onto that later, there was a piece of marble stone that was found alongside her leaden coffin. You can still see this today at Sudeley Castle. It looks very much like the end part of a dress, so how it narrows down towards the feet, and with all of the ruffles that you would find and expect from somebody carving fabric. So there's that piece of archaeological evidence. There's also a fantastic woodcut in Thomas Bentley's The Monuments of Matrons. Now, I stumbled upon this purely by accident. I was looking and researching through Emma Dent's Annals and Chronicles of Sudley, and she mentioned this wood carving. So I did a bit of research and I found it. Now, Thomas Bentley was a churchwarden at St Andrew's, Holborn, a major church in Gray's Inn in London. And this Monuments of Matrons was the first comprehensive prayer book for women, and include much of Catherine's own writings. What we see within this woodcut is we see a monument, a highly decorated page below. So the monument is below a rainbow, and there's a small caption saying Q Parr. Above the rainbow is Christ sat in judgment, bestowing a crown upon a female figure. Now, Emma Dent, she was a 19th century owner of Sudeley Castle, but she was also a very keen antiquarian. She interpreted that figure as Parr herself. But what I find really interesting is if you look at the design of that monument, that sepulchre in the woodcut, it parallels, it's very similar to the stone that is still at Sudley, definitely in terms of that bottom part. And I mean, there's only 34 years between Parr's death and the publication of this monument. So it's very reasonable to think that there could be a possibility that Thomas did either see the monument, or he knows somebody else that sees the monument. He's in the kind of the right area. Now, we don't know if Parr had planned the tomb herself. There's no evidence for that. But it's possible that there might have been some level of agency. As we previously mentioned, there was English in the funeral liturgy. And I can't help but feel that that might be something that Parr was very keen on promoting. She was also very good during her lifetime at understanding the medium of portraiture and using portraiture to reinforce royal positions. So she understood art and iconography in terms of promoting memory and promoting status. So I think on the balance of probability, she probably had something to do with it, but it's not very clear how much. The only thing that we can say for certain, so if listeners want a certainty, we have the epitaph that was on her tomb. And this is because it was discovered on the leaden coffin when her body was discovered. And this epitaph basically confirms that it's Katherine Parr and defines her as the wife of Henry VIII and the late Lord Protector Thomas Seymour, Baron of Sudley. It's very clear that from this epitaph, she is being confined and constricted and presented in the terms of her marriages and by her marriages.
Absolutely. And that woodcut, that sounds fascinating. I'll need to have a look at that. I don't think I've seen that one before. So that's really exciting. So, of course, you just hinted earlier, Charlotte, that her tomb has been disturbed over the centuries, sadly. So tell us a little bit about these occasions and also what motivated those people that were kind of looking for Catherine or that found her eventually.
Okay, strap in for quite a roller coaster of a ride. So the first evidence that we have of the tomb either being disturbed or destroyed is in the Civil War. Now, Catherine's tomb isn't mentioned directly, but the evidence of what happened to the castle would again strongly suggest that the tomb was destroyed at that time. So Sudeley Castle was actually quite an important position for both the royalists and the parliamentarians, and they would often fight out and siege the castle and retake it from one another. But essentially, in 1643, the castle was the scene of several attacks. It began to swap hands. And in 1644, the parliamentarians got control of the castle back. And the governor of this castle was Captain Richard Alworth. And he became part of a committee which ruled the castle and suggested that the castle should be restored. It's been under several sieges. It had been fairly destroyed by that time. However, this restoration didn't come to be. And actually, there was a committee that was run by Parliament that basically said, no, we're not going to allow this restoration to take place. It's interesting that parliamentarian soldiers, and it's really important to kind of understand this, but parliamentarian soldiers were specifically ordered to exclude the monuments of kings and nobles from acts of destruction across the country. But I think from my research, I think this was generally ignored. And I don't think that there's any maliciousness or direct egregiousness against the individual in the tomb. I think what we see is essentially soldiers being told to go forth and destroy a site, getting carried away and completely destroying everything and taking bits and pieces from the tombscape as they go. And we saw that with Catherine of Aragon as well. People would be taking the brasses off, for example. Yeah, unfortunately, I do think that it was during this that not only the castle, but Catherine's tomb was destroyed. And for a very, very long time, Catherine's tomb was lost. We get a antiquarian who visited the castle in the late 18th century, who was totally unaware that Katherine Parr was buried there and claimed that her tomb was just lost to memory. So by the late 18th century, if a monument had existed, it was not there. It wasn't there. It couldn't be seen at that time. So this leads us up to the rediscovery of Parr's body. And this was in May 1782. I love this story. I don't know how true it is. It could have been, it could and has possibly been romanticized, but I love it. This idea of a group of ladies who were going on an afternoon walk. And they were exploring the chapel when they noticed a large block of alabaster fixed to the north wall and got a bit curious about this. So they employed a local farmer to dig down, and 2 feet below the surface, they find a lead coffin. The lead coffin was identified thanks to the effigy that we've already mentioned as Katherine Parr. So the farmer, we know, was Mr. John Lucas, and he apparently ripped up the top of the coffin, expecting to find within it only the dead bones, but to his great surprise found the whole body entire and uncorrupted, wrapped in 7 or 8 linen cere cloths. So Parr's body was obviously very well preserved, but that's the first time we see an actual disturbance of her body instead of her monument. Now, in the subsequent decades, what we find is lots of people are obviously really interested that this queen has been found. And we get people coming to do, or antiquarians coming to Sudeley and wanting to see the body. So they dig Katherine Parr up several times. And it's during this time that we start to get there's a lot of cuttings of her hair or cuttings of the cloth that was wrapped around her, and they're taken away for souvenirs. And again, if you go to Sudeley Castle, you can see they've still got like locks of her hair within like a little glass frame. There was trophy hunting, but there was also a genuine interest in this queen. Now, with all of the disturbances, the Lord of Sudeley, who was a member of the Chandos family at the time, asked for every possible attention to be paid to the remains of this truly virtuous, prudent woman. And because of the amount of disturbances, it was decreed that she would be laid to rest in the Chandos vault. Okay, so this is the family vault. Unfortunately, the men who were asked to rebury Catherine got slightly drunk, and that's an understatement. They got very drunk. And in the process of reburying Catherine, what they actually did was they exhumed her body, opened the lead coffin. There's evidence of them pulling off her arms, cutting her head off with a spade, stabbing her with an iron bar, mutilating her body, throwing bits into the local river. It's really shocking to read from our point of view, but it was also condemned at the time. It was seen that this was an absolutely atrocious act to have been done on this person. So unfortunately, her body was really, really disrespected. And finally in 1817, her coffin, everything was put back together. Her coffin was put in the Chandos vaults to prevent from further disturbances.
Isn't that a horrific story? I knew most of that story, but I actually hadn't heard of the fact that those men did that. Goodness. And so you've said that she was finally laid to rest. And of course, if you go today, there's an absolutely beautiful tombscape that you can see. So tell us a little bit about, we obviously don't know very much about the original one, as you've already talked about, but how do we get this sort of stunning sculpture that we see today?
Oh, we've got a lot more evidence about that. So Parr is laid to rest in the Chandos vault, as I said, and between 1817 and when they start to think about rebuilding her tomb in the 1850s, Sudeley Castle is brought by the Dent family. Now, they were local entrepreneurs and industrialists who had made their money. And the castle was inherited after William Dent had passed away. The castle was inherited by his son, John Dent. And John was a very keen antiquarian, very keen. He would go around loads of auctions, like the Strawberry Hill auction, and he brought so many random pieces of ephemera, historical ephemera, which again are still on display at Sudeley Castle. But for example, I think it was the allegory of the accession of the Tudor monarchs painting he brought and is there. There's a letter from Louis XIV. It's bizarre, but it's great. And what exactly happened was, because there was such an intense interest in the past from John Dent and his wife Emma, who wrote the Annals of Sudley, there was an interest in trying to restore the castle, not just as a home, but restore all of the castle, including the chapel. So that's what John Dent began to do, was to restore the chapel to how, in the Victorian sense, it would have been. And I use quotation marks, and I stress the quotation marks. During the restoration of the chapel, that's when we start to get thoughts and questions as to whether Catherine should be given a new monument. Now, there's quite a lot of letters going to and fro between several different people, but we know that the actual design was done by Sir George Gilbert Scott, a very prominent architect who would later go on to do such stuff like the Royal Albert Hall. But this was kind of one of his earlier engagements. So what we see is the tomb being redesigned, both by George Gilbert Scott, but also with input from John Dent. So in the letters, there's a lot of references to, oh yes, I agree that we should put on these shields, heraldry shields, which represent her previous husband. That was actually John Dent's idea. So the new 19th century tomb is very much built up by these antiquarian Victorian men. And again, there is a focus on her marriages. So if you look at the tomb today, the main design, apart from the beautiful alabaster effigy on top, the main design are those coats of arms of her previous husbands. So again, it's very much defining her as a wife. Now, this could be that the Victorian value, this idea of Catherine had been a nursemaid and a good wife for Henry VIII, and they wanted to kind of promote that. So there could have been an element of playing into what Victorian people expected. But when we think about, apart from redesigning the tomb, what was the motive for creating a new tomb for Catherine? And I've got a funny feeling that some part of it might be to do with this idea of social status. So the Dents, obviously having made their money, trying to fit in with the middle classes, they held lots of balls. They, even at one stage, there's a great photograph where Mr. and Mrs. Dent dress up as Henry VIII and Katherine Parr, but they liked showing people around the collection. And they described and thought that this new tomb would be the crowning glory of their collection. And it's that phrase which makes me think that the impetus to create the tomb wasn't necessarily to praise Catherine and respect her memory. It might have been a little bit of showing off and look, we have a Queen of England buried here, and look, we can look at all of our other stuff. So it was seen as part of their collection, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's a little sad, isn't it? It makes sense with what you're saying about the family, because I do believe she's the only queen buried on private ground. Yeah. So it is quite a boasting point for the family, I suppose, if that's how you're looking at it. Such a beautiful space, though. I've had the pleasure of sitting in there on my own. I visited Sudley early one day and there was no one there, and it was incredibly moving. I have been able to visit all the tombs of the wives, or their final resting places, I should say. And that is one of the most moving, I feel. I don't know if it's about the fact that you think about all the people that have been at Sudley. You mentioned going back to of course, Richard III and Boleyn and Henry VIII spent time at Sudeley Castle. So there's just so much there, isn't there, to kind of reflect on. And it is a very moving experience.
And I think because she is out of the six wives, she's the only one with a what I'm going to say is like a 3D monument. Catherine of Aragon does have a monument, but it's a marble slab in the floor. Yeah. Catherine Parr is Catherine Parr and Anne of Cleves are the only ones with this kind of 3D monument, but you can't really get to Anne of Cleves' tomb very easily because it's in Westminster Abbey and it's right on the Cosmata pavement, which nobody can walk on. Whereas with Catherine Parr's, you can get right up close to it. And I do think it's a really beautiful tomb in terms of how it's designed. It's got that fabulous canopy over the top. It's got griffins and it's got the greyhound on it, beautiful lettering all around and the epitaph. And I do agree. I think there's something about it being in such a private, small space. And when you can be in there on your own, it just gives it a total different feeling. And I think when you consider what her body had been through afterwards, whether the tomb was designed for showing off or not, I'm just kind of somewhat glad that she's got a place to rest in peace.
Yeah, that's so true. You can get up really close to it, obviously, right next to it, whereas some of the other queens, you're not able to. So it is really beautiful. And I believe the shell of the church is quite original, but as you've said, all the inside is kind of Victorianized, but still a really lovely space. So I do highly recommend it. So when we talked about Catherine of Aragon's burial place, we talked about how her memory is being promoted by Peterborough Cathedral. And I'd like to do the same here. I'd love to know how people have interacted with Katherine Parr's tomb. We've heard some of the more unsavoury stories, but over the centuries. And how does Sudeley Castle now kind of promote Catherine's memory?
Yes, so not much has actually changed in terms of Katherine Parr's tomb or tombscape since the mid 19th century. So it's kind of remained fairly consistent. Not much has been added, unlike Katherine Parr, Catherine of Aragon, where you get the standards being added and you get the lettering being added. What really has changed and what's really significant is Sudley being turned into a heritage site and opening to the public. Now, again, like I kind of theorised with Peterborough Cathedral, I think that this is really important and has changed how we view both Catherine's memories. So with Sudley becoming a heritage site, they've opened up a lot of rooms for exhibition material, and going around a lot is focused upon Catherine. When you go onto their website, there is a whole section dedicated to Catherine, and it really promotes her and the link that Sudley has with her. So I think now, just like as I said with Peterborough Cathedral and Catherine of Aragon, I think Sudley has become an extension. The whole site is an extension of Catherine's tombscape. It all promotes her memory because you've got elements of her tombscape, the original one, or when she was rediscovered, it's in the exhibition in the castle. So you're learning a bit more about that. You're also learning more about her life. They've got her original letters in there, which are absolutely amazing to look at. And they're really trying to promote Catherine as more than just a nursemaid to Henry VIII and flesh her out, which is absolutely brilliant. So I think that we can say that the tombscape now is more than just in that little chapel. It's the whole site, and it probably brings Catherine's memory is probably what draws a lot of visitors to that site each year. Just like Catherine of Aragon, there's also talks and everything that go on about Katherine Parr. So again, it's encouraging research. It's encouraging that exploration into her life and expanding our knowledge so that we know that she's not just a wife like she is portrayed on the tomb. She's not just a nursemaid, but she was an intelligent woman who was a patron of female artists, a promoter of the reformist cause, was one of the first females to write religious devotional texts. And it's all portrayed within this site. So it's really interesting and really fabulous to see that it's spreading out and it's giving context. It's giving more than what a simple slab or what one monument could possibly do.
Wonderful. And as is your wonderful research. And I'm so eager to hear more about it as you continue and hopefully publish it one day for all of us eager people to read. So before I let you go, I can't let you go just yet. I just have the question of the Tudor takeaway, Charlotte. So I do ask all my guests for a takeaway, for something for our listeners to go off and explore after the episodes. Do you have a takeaway for us?
Yes, I have two. One is not going to be a surprise. My first Tudor takeaway is definitely go and visit Sudeley Castle if you can, or look at their website and engage in their website because it's absolutely stunning. And when I visited there, they were so kind and helpful and accommodated me so much. The archivist, Derek, who works there, was just so lovely and took me around everywhere and was showing me all this stuff. And I got quite emotional, not only at seeing like stuff that Catherine had owned, but I think the most emotional moment for me was when I thought her hair was quite similar colour to mine, and I put mine up, and the hair that was in the little round frame was actually the same colour as mine, and I just got stupidly emotional about that. And I was like, I know we don't know for sure, if this is, but it's highly likely. So, but it's an absolutely gorgeous site. And again, yeah, go pay your respects to Catherine. My other Tudor takeaway is, at the moment, a certain TV program is nearing its end, and it's my guilty pleasure, but I absolutely love it. It's Wolf Hall, Mirror and the Light. It's on BBC iPlayer at the moment, and the last episode is due to be released on Sunday. So if your listeners, by the time this goes out, your listeners will not have to have what I've had, which is a week's wait of really tense. I know what's going to happen. It's really silly, but I'm genuinely, I think it's done really, really well. I love the acting in it, but I also love the history and the way that those people are portrayed. I think that's how I have some of those characters in my head. So I think it's fabulous. If you can get on BBC iPlayer and watch it, go for it. But the original Wolf Hall is obviously, it's in book form, but I know that they've got a DVD of it. So if you can get it in DVD, go for it.
Yeah. Oh, what wonderful takeaways. I have to say, I've got the last two. Well, everyone's got the last episode to go, but I've got the last two to go. And it sounds so silly, as you said, but I'm kind of reluctant because I know what's going to happen. And even though Thomas Cromwell's not my favorite character, I still just kind of feel for him because, of course, he's been portrayed so brilliantly in this series. So I need to watch it. I'm going to be brave and put on the second last episode today so that I can be ready for what's to come. Brilliant.
Enough. My husband keeps going down, and I know it's spoilers, but my husband keeps coming down and goes, has he been executed yet? I'm like, no, shush, it's not that part yet.
Exactly. I know. I'm kind of dreading that, to be honest with you. I don't know what that's going to be like. But Charlotte, thank you so much again for taking the time to come back onto the podcast and talk to us about this really fascinating subject. I really appreciate it.
No worries. Lovely to talk to you too, Natalie.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Talking Tudors. Thank you so much for joining us. I absolutely love to hear from listeners, so if you have any comments or suggestions, or just want to say hi, please get in touch with me via my website, www.onthetudortrail.com, where you'll also find show notes for today's episode. If you've enjoyed the show, please share the podcast with friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. I also invite you to join our Talking Tudors podcast group on Facebook, where you can interact with other Tudor history lovers and hear all the behind-the-scenes news. You'll also find me on Twitter. My handle is On The Tudor Trail, and on Instagram as The Most Happy 78. It's time now for us to re-enter the modern world. As always, I look forward to talking Tudors with you again very soon.